So here on this slug page, on this catch-all page, we're currently getting the concrete path values from the router to then get the year and the month and fetch the appropriate events for us here. Now the question is, how do we want to do that in the future with our newly gained knowledge? And we have a couple of options here. We can use getStaticProps to pre-generate this. But of course, for the filtered events, we'll have a lot of different combinations of parameters. 2021 and 1 and 5 and 2 and so on. That's not necessarily an issue though, because we will have to use getStaticPaths anyways. And once we add that, we could only pre-render a couple of those combinations and not all of them. And instead then use fallback set to true or blocking. But how should we decide which paths should be pre-generated? In the end, all possible filters are equally likely to be visited. So I would have a hard time picking a couple of combinations that should be pre-generated. And pre-generating all possible combinations is also not a great option because that could be a lot of pages, especially if we have no year restriction, for example. So getStaticProps might not be ideal here. Maybe here getServerSideProps is better, so that we do indeed fetch the data on the fly for every incoming request, and we then return the page for every incoming request. So let's start with that. In this slug page, I will export an async function called getServerSideProps. And you know that here we get the context. And then here we want to return an object which is similar to the object we return in getStaticProps, with a props key and possibly also with the notFound key and the redirect key if we need it. Now here, from the context, we can get access to the params. So here we can get access to the parameters for which this page was visited. And that's good because now we basically want to repeat what we previously did in our component function. We want to get our year and month and convert that to a number and then validate it and then ultimately get our filtered events. So I will copy all that code, though we're going to edit it a bit, but I'll copy all that code and bring it down there into getServerSideProps. Now here, we're accessing filtered data. That should actually be our params. Because up there, filtered data is also just what we read from the router query, which are also our params when accessed through useRouter. So therefore here, I'll rebuild filter data and access params.slug. So we still access .slug because that is our catch-all grouping parameter name, if you want to call it like that. And that will still be an array with multiple values, and we are interested in the first two values, which should be the year and the month, which is why we convert them to numbers and then validate them down there. Now, if validation fails, however, we don't want to return JSX. That's not possible in getServerSideProps. We always have to return an object instead. But if the validation fails, I don't want to return a props object here or a props key. Instead here, I'll then set notFound to true. I want to show the 404 page if an invalid parameter combination is passed in. We could also consider redirecting to some error page if we had one. But here we don't have one. We could add one, but I will not do it here, so I'll comment this out and instead show the 404 error page. Another alternative would be to set some props, like the hasError prop, and then handle this specific prop in our component function to show an error message. And actually, since we do have that error-specific JSX code here, that might actually be the best alternative. So it's still worth knowing the other ones, but I will now not show the 404 page, but instead return my special hasError prop set to true if the validation fails. So that in the component function, in this filtered events page function, we should expect props, and then down there, instead of validating our query parameters, I check if props has error is true. And if that's the case, I'll show this error message. I think that actually makes the most sense, but you can also go with one of the two alternatives I showed. Now, if we make it past this if check, we do have valid parameter values, and therefore now we want to get our filtered events. For this, I'll go to dummy data and take this getFilteredEvents function and bring that over into API util, maybe down there. Here, we get filtered events by reaching out to dummy events and calling filter on that. Now, just as in the other functions here, I will instead now turn this into an async function, then get access to all events by awaiting get all events, and then using all events here instead of dummy events for filtering. And with that, back in this Slug page, we now want to import get filtered events, not from dummy data, but from the helpers folder and the API util file. And then down there in get server-side props, we now get our filtered events by awaiting get filtered events to which we still pass this object with this data, because I haven't changed the function signature of this function. It still wants the same parameter. But we should await because this is now an async function returning a promise therefore. So that gives us our filtered events, and hence here through props, we can expose our events, our filtered events, through an events prop. And therefore back in the component function, now in there, we actually don't really need to parse the URL anymore, though I'll keep that code around for now, but I will comment it out like this. Instead, now we are already using props has error, and I now also, in addition, want to set my filtered events here equal to props.events. So this events prop which we populate in get server-side props. With that, if we save this, if I reload this page for this kind of filter, I still get no events found. Now, if I do pick a combination that exists though, I get an error. Num year is not defined. That makes sense because down there I am constructing a date with num year and num month, and we're not having that anymore because I am not extracting it from the URL anymore. Now we could do that, but since we do get it in get server-side props anyways, we can just expose num year and month through props to the component. So here, besides exposing the events, I'll also expose my date, and here I'll then just expose this as an object where year is set equal to num year and month is set equal to num month. And now that we expose this date prop, we can go to the component function and build a date by accessing props.date.year and then props.date.month. So these props which we just added. For that, if we save this and reload, now this gets loaded correctly. And this is now pre-rendered on the fly on the server for every incoming request, because we are using get server-side props here. And of course, again, we can see that if we inspect the page source, there the event data is part of that HTML content. And again, if I use some other filter where we don't find any events, we see that message. And if I enter something invalid here, we see the invalid filter page. And that also is pre-rendered, as you can see here. So that's how we can use get server-side props.